Hello, 7th graders. Today's lesson has to do with simple probability. It's one of my favorite units because I like to play a lot of games, and probability is involved in a lot of board games, card games, sports, all sorts of stuff. Alright, so let's get started. Simple probability is the likelihood that an event will take place. Alright, so it's like, what's the probability that Mr. Legas says 100 times during this video? It's highly likely. Alright, so let's talk about the basics before we start some examples. To find the probability of an event, so a lot of times you'll see P and then in parentheses event, you need the number of favorable outcomes divided by the number of possible outcomes. So the probability of an event is the number of favorable outcomes divided by the number of possible outcomes. And a lot of times we'll leave this as a simplified fraction. Alright, so let's talk a game as our example. My oldest son really likes to play Trouble. Alright, so here you see a Trouble board. And in the center we have a 6-sided die. Alright, you pop it. Alright, you've got 6 outcomes. You can get a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, a 5, and a 6. Alright, so we have 6 possible outcomes. Now if I was playing Trouble with my oldest son Scotty and I wanted to figure out what the probability of getting a 1 is, I could say probability of 1 is my number of favorable outcomes, which is only 1 because I only have one favorable outcome, that's a 1. So there's one possible outcome that I like, divided by my number of possible outcomes, which is 6 because I could get a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. Alright, so the probability of getting a 1 is 1/6. Now if you need to see that in a different manner, I could write all my possible outcomes as a sample space. Alright, so I could just come up with a list. I could get an outcome of a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, a 5, or a 6. Alright, so I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 possible outcomes. My favorable outcome in that case, though, was only a 1. Alright, I only had one favorable outcome. Alright, so a probability of 1/6, I would call that less likely. So that's not very likely. It'll happen, 1 out of 6 times, but I could say something like that's less likely. Alright, so you'll see some words, less likely. Now, what's the probability of getting, let's say a 1 or a 2? Probability of a 1 or 2. Alright, so I need my favorable outcomes, which would be the 1 or the 2. So I have 2 choices for favorable outcomes, all divided by my number of possible outcomes, which is still 6. Alright, so the probability of getting a 1 or a 2 is 2/6. I could simplify that to 1/3. Alright, so I would say the probability of getting a 1 or a 2 is 1/3. Alright, again, that's still less likely than some of our other choices. Let's say the probability of an even number. Alright, so my probability of getting an even number, well, let's look at the favorable outcomes. Well, what are the even numbers I could get? I could get a 2, a 4, or a 6. Alright, so my favorable outcomes, I have 3. All over my total outcomes or possible outcomes, again, I have 6 possible outcomes. So that's 3/6, and I could simplify that to 1/2. Alright, so the probability of getting an even number is 1/2. Alright, we could say that's equally likely to happen or not happen. So you might see a phrase like equally likely. Alright, let's do 2 more. Alright, how about the probability of a 1 through 6? Alright, my notation's not perfect there, but it's okay. So getting the probability of rolling a 1 through a 6, well, that's all the numbers on the die. Alright, so I have 6 favorable outcomes, all divided by 6 total outcomes. 6/6, that simplifies to 1. Alright, and you will get a probability of 1 every now and then. What that means is that is certainly going to happen. Alright, so you'll see the phrase certain. Alright, that event is certain. It is going to happen. Alright, that's like the probability of Mr. Legas saying in this video. It is certain. It is going to happen. Okay? We have one other instance we need to talk about. How about the probability of rolling a 7? Think for a second. Is that likely? Or is that impossible? That's impossible. All right? We have 0 favorable outcomes. All right? You can't roll a 7. So I have 0 favorable outcomes all over my total possible outcomes, 0 over 6. Anything, 0 divided by anything is just 0. All right? So if you get a probability of 0, that's impossible. All right? And you will see that from time to time. All right? All right, guys. So in summary, the probability of an event is the number of favorable outcomes divided by the number of possible outcomes. All right, make sure you simplify your fractions. All right, remember that your probabilities are always going to be between 0 and 1. All right, if you get a number bigger than 1, go back, you did something wrong. All right, so probabilities are always between 0 and 1. 0 being possible, 1 being certain. All right, I hope you liked this video. As always, send me a message if you guys have questions.